Good evening from Los Angeles, and welcome to Asia Society at the Movies. I'm Charlie Coker, Executive Director of Asia Society Southern California. Thank you for joining us for this evening's program, a conversation with renowned Chinese director Jia Zhang-Ke on his latest film, Swimming Out Till the Sea Turns Blue. Our moderator for this evening is Michael Berry, who's the Director of the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA, as well as a professor of contemporary Chinese cultural studies. In addition to having served as a film consultant and a juror for numerous film festivals, Michael is a published author and editor of a number of books on Chinese literature and cinema, as well as a two-time National Endowment for the Arts Translation Fellow. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's really wonderful to be part of this event with the Asia Society. The first order of business for me is to introduce our featured speaker tonight, which is Mr. Jia Zhang-Ke. Jia Zhang-Ke studied art at Shanxi University in Taiyuan. He later studied film at Beijing Film Academy in 1993. It was during his time at the Beijing Film Academy that he first started to direct a series of student films, which started to gain some notoriety internationally, especially in Hong Kong, where he was able to put together his early production team. His first three feature films, Xiaowu, Platform, and Unknown Pleasures, are generally considered part of what's called the Hometown Trilogy. And it was around the time that Jia was promoting the third film in that series, Unknown Pleasures, is when I met him in 2002, almost 20 years ago in New York. And that was also the first time that Martin Scorsese met Jia Zhang-Ke. And that he actually summoned Jia to his office where he had seen Xiaowu and was so blown away that he said to him, every 10, 20, 30 years, somebody comes around and they reinvent cinema. You reinvented cinema. And I think that speaks a lot to what Jia did with those early films, but also over the course of the next 20 years, Jia Zhang-Ke would continue to refine and reinvent what cinema really means with films like The World, Still Life, Touch of Sin, Ashes the Purest White. He is also the director of several documentary films, including Dong, Useless, I Wish I Knew, and of course the film we're going to be talking about tonight, his most recent documentary, Swimming Out Till the Sea Turns Blue. He has been awarded major honors from everywhere from Berlin to Venice to Cannes, and it's such a pleasure to welcome Jia Zhang-Ke tonight for a special discussion about his new documentary film and also about the interrelation between literature and film, which is the subject of this film. So, Jia Da, 欢迎您。
谢谢 Michael， 谢谢 Charlie， 很高兴能够借由亚洲协会来介绍我最新的这部纪录片《一直游到海水变蓝》。
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Charlie. It's an honor to be here at the Asia Society to introduce my most recent film, Swimming Out Till the Sea Turns Blue. And as you could tell, I'm also going to be double duty as moderator and interpreter. And before we begin our questions, we have actually the trailer for the film that we're going to roll to give you a little sense of the film before we start discussing it. Could we run the trailer, please?
书上说，你生在那里，其实你的一半就死在那里。所以故乡也叫雪地。
您现在看到的这一侧呢，是我们贾庄村的一张山水图，主要展现的是我们现在贾庄的村容村貌以及未来贾庄的一个文化。 很多。
你们在这里做什么？哦，没什么，长官，我们在这里聊天。聊天？打开行李箱给我看看，快打开行李箱，打开呀！
或者是站在家乡来看中国世界的。
So I don't know if you can tell from the trailer there, but this is very much a film about literature. And my first question has to do with the relationship between literature and film in China. For those who follow contemporary Chinese cinema, you'll know that from 1949 all the way into the 1980s, the vast majority of films were adapted from literary sources. Jia's generation, the so-called sixth generation, is the generation where there was a real break from that. And we started to see a large number of works being original content as opposed to literary adaptations. And so I wanted to start by asking Jia about during his formative years in the 80s and the 90s, what were the literary works that most impacted you?
就是头一个问题是，这部片子其实就是关于文学吧。那么在中国电影历史的脉络里头，文学一直扮演了一个非常重要的一个角色。从49年一直到了80年代，大部分的电影都改编自文学作品吧。其实第6代应该算是一个非常大的一个断裂，因为开始有自创的一些故事。那么我很好奇，您在80年代、90年代整个成长过程当中，有哪些文学作品给您带来最大的启发和影响？
我觉得可能在80年代那个年代，我在上初中和高中，那个年代主要是中国文学，主要是当代的部分，就是当时80年代中国文学处在一个很活跃的阶段，因为那个时候人们还都非常喜欢阅读小说，有各种各样的小说的期刊。在众多的作家里面，当时对我影响大的比较重要的作家，包括像这个一直游到海水变蓝里面的贾平凹，那个像这个他写他的家乡的一些小说，也包括像路遥先生，他有一部小说叫做《人生》，就是那个时候带着中国社会刚刚开放的这样一个背景里面，人们对于中国社会中国人的生活的这个现实的描述，对我们当时的这些年轻的阅读者来说特别有吸引力。那么一直到90年代，我上北京电影学院之后，就开始重新发现和有兴趣过去的这个上一辈的作家，特别是像沈从文先生、张爱玲先生，就是这2位的文学作品，其实过去一直在49年之后，我们并不是谈论的很多，但是改革开放到了90年代呢，又突然我们发现原来中国社会、中国过去有那么好的文学，特别是沈从文，他跟我个人的生活经历很像，我们都是从很偏远的、很小的乡村到了大的城市生活，就既有一个本土的故乡，又进入到都市之后，遭遇了新的情况、新的问题，所以在精神上，这个沈从文的小说对我影响很大。
So during my time in middle school and high school, this is basically during the 1980s, contemporary Chinese literature had a really huge impact upon me. It was a very active and lively period where so much was happening on the literary scene. There was a whole series of new literary journals that were coming up, and there were a series of authors that in particular really touched me. One is Jia Pingwa, who was featured in this film.
what he wrote about his hometown and the relationship with his hometown was just really eye-opening. Another writer from that era that had a big impact was Lu Yao. Lu Yao wrote a novel called Life, 人生, which also had a really profound impact on me. That was a work from the early Reform era. And these were the type of novels that were part of that literary renaissance of the Reform era. Pushing things forward a little bit in the 1990s, when I was a student at the Beijing Film Academy, I started to open my eyes up to an earlier generation of Chinese writers, writers like Shen Congwen and Eileen Zhang. These were writers that after 1949, comparatively so, didn't get that much attention. A lot of people didn't talk about them during the early years after the founding of the PRC. However, when the Reform era came in the 80s, these writers were rediscovered and they started to come back into our field of vision. And Shen Congwen in particular had a really big impact on me. Part of that, I think, had to do with a similarity in terms of experience. He also is somebody who came from a small town and immigrated to the city and talked about that kind of shock of going from a rural area to these more urban cities. And so that really had a big impact.
那么到90年代同步的呢，有另外一个当代小说吸引我们，就是当时的先锋派小说。那个时候逐渐的像这个书童、余华、松甘露等等这些这个作家，他们的写作方法就跟上一辈导演也有很大的区别。那就好像这个当然他们的作品也很多改编成了电影，像书童的《妻妾成群》改编成了《大红灯笼高高挂》，余华的这个《活着》改编成了被张艺谋改编成了《活着》。那是对于我们在工作的起点跟精神上，我觉得可能跟这一代作家更接近一些。但是我们就是我这个年纪的导演。没有过多的去改编这些文学作品，而是学习他们的文学精神，我们寻找自己的电影语言，以及寻找自己最崭新的对于中国社会的理解。所以到我这一辈的导演，就一部分还在改编文学作品，但是大部分都在自己创作剧本，成为一个作者型的导演。
Another group of writers that had a really big impact on me in the 1990s was a new group of avant-garde writers, and that included writers like Su Tong, Yu Hua, and Sun Ganlu. These were all writers that were very different than that earlier generation I described earlier. They marked a distinctly new type of approach to literature. But actually, a lot of their works were also adapted for film. For instance, Su Tong had a novel called Wives and Concubines that was adapted by Zhang Yimou into the film Raise the Red Lantern. Yu Hua had a novel called To Live, which was adapted by Zhang Yimou into a film of the same name. But I never really wanted to look at these writers as a source of content to be adapted directly into film. Instead, it was more of a starting point for me to understand literary techniques. And so I could take the elements of those stories and learn something about society, learn something about our contemporary condition, and become kind of closer to the role of what we would think of as an auteur director, someone who has that kind of authorial stamp on their work. So thank you. So my next question is about the writers that appear on screen. There's actually quite a few that appear in this documentary. We have Mo Yan, we have Su Tong, Li Jingzhe, Lai, etc. I'm really curious about what made you ultimately decide to home in on these three writers primarily, Jia Pinghua, Yu Hua, and Liang Hong. Could you talk about these three and what is it about their work? Was it their work itself, or was it their presence as a subject that really drew you in?
就是在您这个片子里头，有好多当代的著名作者都有出现，有莫言、有苏童、李金哲叶兆言等等。但是最后你把视角放到贾平凹、余华跟亮红这三位，能不能谈谈他们这三位作家有哪些部分最吸引你？而且最吸引你是他们的作品本身，还是他们人的魅力？因为你毕竟是拍电影嘛，不知道能不能谈这个选择，就是背后为什么最后把视角放到这三位？谢谢。
我想先谈谈这个纪录片的产生，因为我在2006年拍摄了关于画家刘晓东的纪录片《东》，2007年拍摄了关于服装设计师马可的纪录片《无用》。那之后呢，我持续了对于中国当代文学艺术的关注，我非常想再拍一位艺术家。那当时也有很多选择，包括当时我想拍建筑师，拍一个城市的规划师，但都没有成功，因为没有选到好的拍摄对象。那最近几年呢，我搬回了我的家乡，就是电影中的这个家 Family Village， 搬到了这个村庄生活。那我们的这个村庄呢，实际上跟中国的文学有很大的关联，因为它是这个50年代山药蛋派的作家马峰生活、居住、写作的地方，由他的小说当时在50、60年代也改编了好几部电影，是这样的一个有文学传统的一个地方。是2方面促使我拍了这个纪录片，一方面是乡村生活，因为中国社会发展特别快，中国经济加速度发展，在剧烈的城市化，很多年轻人都离开乡村进了大的城市生活，那么就形成了，但是我们都知道中国几千年的历史主要是乡村的生活，它塑造了我们的人格，塑造了我们的行为处事的方法，甚至可以说，如果想理解今天的城市，今天的都市，那我们要回到农村去。但是这种农村的经验的这个，对于很多年轻人来说是没有的，这是一方面。但是与此同时呢，你又会发现，有很多文学家他们在持续的讲述中国的农村的情况、农村的现实，一代一代的文学家。他们作为在农村成长生活的人，也作为一个观察者，也作为一个经历者，一个写作者，一直在这个农村经验一直在中国的文学中没有中断。那我就希望通过电影能够把从1949年到今天整个一个乡村生活的经验、记忆即将流逝的这些记忆因为很多年轻人已经是他的可能父亲那一代是农村来的，到他已经完全对农村一无所知，就好像电影中梁红的儿子一样他的妈妈和农村有那样的一个紧密的结合，但是到他这一代已经可能连语言都快消失了，所以是在这样一个双重的原因之下，想拍这个电影，进而我在想我能够选择谁来进行拍摄。
So before I talk about the 3 subjects that I chose, I think I should begin by giving you a little more background about this film and what led me to it. In 2006, I made a documentary film called Dong, which was about a painter named Liu Xiaodong. In 2007, I then made a film about a fashion designer named Ma Ke called Useless. And so I had this series of films that I'd been working on that were exploring the lives of various artists and creative people in contemporary China. And I thought this was a really important contribution. I wanted to continue that. I wanted to keep exploring different artists. For a while, I thought of making a film like this about an architect, but for various reasons, I just couldn't find the right subject. But one thing that really drew me in was literature. There has always been this group of writers who have been paying close attention to the social change that's been happening in China. And something that was connected was it was around this time that I moved back to my ancestral home or my family village to live. And that was a village where there was a very deep literary connection. There was actually an older generation writer who was quite famous there, who during the 1950s and 60s wrote a series of novels that were adapted into films from the socialist period. And so there was this strong literary connection. And I had 2 main motivations. On the one hand, we were surrounded by this rapid urbanization. Everything was changing. And I felt that in order to really capture what was happening, we needed to return to the roots, return to the rural, to the countryside, and really get a sense, because so much of the crucial understanding we need to understand urban China comes from the rural. You can't understand development and urbanization unless you understand what came before that. And we feel quite fortunate that there have been generation after generation of writers who have been paying attention to this change, and they've been documenting it. They've been experiencing it. They've been observing it. They've been part of that, and it's become part of their work. And so I started turning to this group of writers who I feel ever since 1949 have without ceasing, they have continued to document the disappearing state of the rural reality in China. And you can see that disappearance before your eyes. And that's the other thing that really drove me to make a film like this. Look at the case of Liang Hong in this film. She spent so much of her work trying to document this rural landscape and the lives of rural people in this village. And yet when I spoke to her son in the film, he can barely even speak their native tongue. And so you really sense this, this loss, and that the younger generation, there's so much that's not being carried forward.
那想拍这个影片之后呢，当然就要选择人物，那么是因为我想拍一个，它不是一个时间段的关于农村生活的讲述，它具有一种长时间的跨度，因为不同的历史阶段，中国人经历的问题是不一样的，那么究竟这几十年也就是从一个历史的角度发生了些什么，我们经历了些什么，这是我非常希望通过这个纪录片能够表现的。所以我们首先是从人物的选择上，决定选择几位作家，而不是一位作家。那么因为在中国，这个作家也是有不同时代成长起来的，有代际的划分，他们的成长阶段代表不同的历史阶段。那么我们第一个人物呢，就是马峰先生。马峰先生呢，他已经去世了。那么他所背后的时代呢，是49年到50年代、60年代，也就是我们所称为社会主义建设阶段、集体主义的时代。那么在集体主义的时代，为什么会有集体主义？集体主义之下解决了什么问题？出现了什么问题？这是这个人物，我对于这样一个人物的好奇。那因为他已经过世了，我们就请他的女儿，还有跟他这个相处过的农村的村民来讲述那段生活啊。我们这2位村民，他们就是电影头前面的这2位村民都是已经年龄超过90岁的，他们是幸存者，他们是历史的见证人。那么到贾平凹先生呢，他是50年代出生的，他的记忆就开始从50年代末60年代就开始了。那么到了余华呢，他是60年代出生的，梁鸿是70年代出生的，那么他们这几个人连接起来，从时间上就是一个相对完整的中国当代社会的一个发展的简史。那另外一方面呢，也是从地域的考虑。马峰、贾平凹在中国的西北部，梁鸿、河南在中国的中部，余华在沿海的浙江的海沿在中国的东部。所以这部影片从地理空间上也是一个从西北部到东南部的一个空间的跨度，这样从时间上概括了70年当代中国社会，从空间上覆盖了从中国的西北部到东南沿海的这样一个空间的距离。但更为重要的是他们都有农村的生活经验，同时他们这3位作家都持续的在观察农村、写作农村。当然他们已经在这城市生活，比如说像梁鸿已经在北京师范大学当教授很多年，但是他保持了跟农村的联系，保持了对农村的观察。他带着农村跟城市双重的经验，在观察中国社会的变化。
So part of what I wanted to explore here by delving into the past was this issue of identity, and also one of the period of time that I wanted to cover. And I wanted to make something that was broad enough to encapsulate several decades of change that we have experienced in China. And from that historical perspective, I wanted to ask questions about what we discover when we look at these long periods of history. What do we expose? What do we see? And how does our understanding shift with these stories that we hear? And I knew that in order to do that, I couldn't have the focus on just one writer. It had to be on multiple writers, several generations of writers. And so this issue of the generational shift or the structuring of different generations became quite important. That's why I started with a writer named Ma Feng, who had already passed away, but his writings represent that period from 1949 into the 1960s, the period of socialist construction, the period of collectivization. And I wanted to explore the kind of questions that he and his generation set out to solve through their novels and through their work. Because he had already passed, I had to talk to people like his daughter and other contemporaries of people who knew him. They were all in their 90s, but they're all witnesses to that history. They were witnesses to what he brought. And so he represented that early socialist period. Jia Pinghua is a writer who was born in the early 50s, and his experience represents into the late 50s, the 60s. That's the subject of so much of his memories and the work that he explores. Yu Hua is born another decade later in the 1960s, and Liang Hong yet another decade later. And so you see each writer were coming kind of closer to the contemporary and representing different generations. Another side of this is that each of these writers represent a different geographical space. And so we go from the Northwest eventually to the Southeast. And along that period, we go from inner China to more coastal regions like Hainan. And so Haiyan. And so we're getting kind of a different perspective of the shift between different localities in China. But probably even more important is that all of these writers maintained a very strong tie to the rural throughout their work. Even though many of them ended up living in big cities, they never lost that connection to their hometowns and to these smaller places. So take, for instance, Liang Hong, who later became a professor at Beijing Normal University, and yet throughout her work, she's always going back to the countryside and keeping that connection alive. And you just mentioned this, the geographic sites, which I think is such an important part of this film. I'm wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more about, besides the writers, for the structure of the film, you have all kinds of images of traditional Chinese arts that appear, opera, calligraphy, poetry, but then you also have these different locations, Fenyang, Xi'an, the Yellow River, Haiyan. And can you talk about the structure and how that came together during the creative process? 就是刚刚提到不同的地域吧，地域性的重要性。我觉得这部片子它的从结构的角度来看，除了这几位作家之外呢，你还有好多镜头，有一些练书法或者念诗。或者唱京剧，或者不同地方戏嘛，我觉得这也变成这部电影非常重要的一份子。另外，那个地域戏从汾阳到西安到黄河到海盐，这也变成整个结构非常重要的一部分。能不能谈谈或者介绍这个片子的结构是如何产生的？
这部影片里面确实就像 Michael 说的一样，里面有很多地方戏。这个地方戏呢，我觉得一开始我并没有想去拍这些地方戏，但是呢，逐渐你会发现，这几位作家他们这个都很喜欢地方戏。你像贾平凹非常喜欢这个秦腔。你像这个在汾阳举行那个文学季的时候，那个莫言老师，他很想听山西的晋剧。在他们的身后，因为不同的中国很有特点，就是在不同的地域都有各自的地方戏。地方戏本身呢，它的特点就是用地方语言来表演的。后来我就觉得应该把这些地方戏拍进来，因为这是一个关于作家的电影。那这些作家他们呢，像贾平凹，包括余华，像梁鸿，他们的写作里面，他们的语言保持了很多地方的特点。你像梁鸿一直在写河南，在他的这个非虚构或者虚构的作品里面，都有很多河南话的这个 背影的河南话的这种特点，那像这个贾平凹有很多陕西话的特点，就是利用跟使用方言是这些作家他们共同的一个特点，它涉及到一个语言的问题，所以对电影来说，我们就拍摄这些地方戏来展示它那个地方的语言，展示它的这种文化特点。在一方面呢，我觉得就我刚才讲到这个有很长的时间，有多组人物，有多个地域，我一直在思考我最近几年的问题，为什么一直会采用这样一种办法，包括像 Mountains Made Apart 还有江湖儿女，都采用这样一个长时间的跨度，是因为我隐隐约约觉得我们进入到了一个互联网的时代，其实不同的观点、不同的声音，非常多。我觉得在目前我们去观察中国社会，可能需要一个整体的观点，我们不能，就是我不太想过多的谈论，或者表现一个局部的时间或者一个局部的问题，因为所有的一切可能应该带着一个整体性的结构观点，从一个比较长的时间里去感觉、去理解、去描写，特别是去深入到一个因果的这样的一个关系里面去理解中国社会，所以一直游到海水变蓝也用了比较漫长的时间，因为我们可以表现很多时间点，比如说我们只是去拍摄余华的时代，或者只是去拍摄梁鸿的时代，但是我们要理解梁鸿的时代，可能我们往往从方法上我们需要回到马峰的时代，梁鸿那样的个人化，他那样的私人化的写作，他的背景是50、60年代我们的集体化，如果不理解那个年代，可能也理解不了梁鸿。我觉得，所以对这个影片来说，加上马峰4个人物，70年的时间，我觉得目前在我的文化环境里，我觉得思考问题、考虑问题、去理解中国，需要用这样的一个整体化的观念，要看到一个全貌。谢谢。
So, in terms of, one of the elements that you mentioned was local opera, and that's something that originally actually I had no plan to include in this film. But as I was shooting these different writers, I realized that all of the writers had this deep love for local opera. So you see Shanxi opera, you see all these sequences throughout the film of these opera performers in parks and performing. And that all came from just the organic process of shooting this. So when we shot Mo Yan at this literary festival, I learned that he had a great interest in hearing how local Shanxi opera performers sing Peking opera. Jia Pingwa, he has a deep, deep affection for Shanxi opera. Everybody had this kind of natural affinity for local opera. And I started to think about that and realized that these opera, they're all gives them the local flavor is the fact that they're all sung in a local dialect. And through that dialect, you get a real sense of the local color and the local flavor. And so much is exhibited through these different operatic performances. And I also realized that all the writers that I'm looking at here, through their work, you see a deep connection to the sites and places where they grew up. So Liang Hong is from Henan, and she often uses Henan dialect in her works. Jia Pingwa often uses Shanxi dialect in his novels. And you'd really see that connection between the sites and the language and the opera. And so eventually that became a big part of the structure of the film. And I started to pull it in. At the same time, this bigger question of the periodization of spanning such a broad span of time, decades, and different sites, different locations. This is something that I think I've been doing in my films consciously or unconsciously over the last couple of years. And so you can see that kind of structure in Mountains Made Apart, Ash is the Purest White, where I'm looking at a very broad canvas. And part of that is the notion of wanting to give a portrait of reality in my films that's encapsulating, that it's broad, and that it's only through that that we can really understand the causes and effects of what's happening in society and understand what's going on. Had we taken it apart and say for this documentary film, had I just put the entire focus on, for instance, Liang Hong, sure, you could understand a lot about her, but I'm afraid some aspects of her work and her life you'd never really be able to understand unless you looked at writers like from Yu Hua's generation, the earlier generation, the collective generation that came earlier. The same with Ma Feng, the same with each of these. They all build upon each other. And so when we include these 4 writers, Ma Feng, Jia Pinghua, Yu Hua, and Liang Hong, we get 70 years of Chinese history. And I think if you really want to understand China, you need that deep, comprehensive, and complex vision of history to look at it. I want to ask, in many of Jia's films, there's a very interesting relationship between documentary film and feature films. So you've made documentaries earlier like In Public, which had a very deep relationship to unknown pleasures. You also made a film called Dong, which you just mentioned, that was tied to your feature film, Still Life. I'm wondering, does swimming, this film we're talking about, have any kind of connection to your recent narrative films? Is there a direct line there? 就是说您前面拍的几部纪录片，其中一部分跟您的剧情片有非常直接的关系，像公共场所跟任逍遥有一种关系，或者动跟三峡好人也是有一个非常亲密的关联。那这个一直游到海里变蓝这部片子，跟您最近拍的剧情片也有一种关系吗？或者它有影响到你近期拍的剧情电影吗？
我觉得它一直游到海水变蓝，没有像公共场所到任逍遥，东到三峡好人这样一种直接的关联关系。但是我觉得它可能会它一些新的尝试可能会带来我未来电影的一些变化。那我觉得刚才我们讲了这个影片的这个大的结构，这些大的结构。从时间的角度和这个地域的角度的结构方法，但是在我剪辑这部影片的时候，实际上这部影片也是相对来说我所有电影中呈现的最主观色彩的一部影片，因为最后那个结构实际上变成了18个章节，就像因为这个章节是中国传统文学里面的一种分段的方法，而这十几个章节呢，实际上是在一个线性的描述的基础上，从人们的这种从这几位作家他们讲述里面，我们会发现实际上每一个人物每一个年代或者每一个人物背后都是他们那个时代所要解决的问题，所面临的困难，他们的一个成长的过程或者发展的过程，就是克服跟解决这些困难的过程。困难永远会有，那这个一代人有一代人的问题。那所以最后呢，实际上这部影片就提炼成了十几个关键词，包括一开始第一个段落就叫吃饭，那是人生存的基础，也是50、60年代对于中国人最大的一个难题，最大的一个问题，是他们生活中碰到的最大的一个障碍，解决吃饭的问题。那逐渐的有自由恋爱的问题，有病的问题，有家庭问题。到梁红的时候更加的个人化，他有家庭的问题，父亲的问题，母亲的问题，姐姐的问题，所以从这个角度来说呢，是实际上最后这个电影的结构，它不单单是线性的结构，它像18个章节，像18个纪念碑一样，它标志着我们经历过的那些痛苦，它是一个，就像 Michael 你的示意一下，它是一个痛史，就是我们经历过哪些苦难，经历过哪些痛苦，我觉得这样的一种提炼，这样一种主观的一个重新的结构，在一直游到海水变蓝里面可以说是第一次使用，也许它会影响到我下面作品的拍摄。
So unlike those films that you mentioned, where there was indeed a direct relationship between documentary films I made and feature films I made, there really wasn't this direct connection in this case. But that's not to say that it might not impact my future feature films going forward. I talked about the structure of this film earlier and how I use these different places and locales to help structure things. But another part of that were the keywords that appear, these different structuring device of chapters. So there's actually 18 chapters that I use in Swimming Out Till the Sea Turns Blue. And these represent different eras, but also kind of different periods and ways to think about Chinese history. There's also a deep literary connection because in traditional Chinese literature, we would have these chapter breakdowns, right, for a novel. And so that also is part of a homage to this way in which this is a film about literature. For each generation of writers, there's their own keywords or their own issues that they're dealing with. And so when the film begins, there's a chapter called Eating, 吃饭, and that was a kind of foundational problem or an issue that people of that generation were facing. How are you going to feed everybody? How are we going to sustain ourselves? How are we going to get food on the table? That was a basic problem that people of Ma Feng's generation were facing early on. But then over history, the problems that these writers face start to shift and they start to change. And more it becomes a issue of each generation. What are their problems and how did they approach them? How did they attempt to solve them? How did they attempt to navigate these problems? And so you go from the basic issues of eating and getting food on the table to later issues like illness and disease and eventually family problems. So you see with Liang Hong, all of these issues with her sister and her parents, and all of this became a structuring device for this film. And so in the end, we have 18 moments. And I even look at them as monuments, 18 monuments to these different periods in history of what we've experienced and how people from a very subjective perspective approach those and tried to solve them. In some ways, it's similar to your book, Michael, A History of Pain. These are all histories of pain. These are monuments of suffering. And this is the first time I took this kind of approach, which is probably the most subjective approach I've ever taken in a film. But I do suspect that when I move forward with other feature films, this might indeed play a role. And so I'm going to ask one more question before we move to our audience and get some audience questions. And that's very early in this film, we start seeing images of young people looking at their cell phones. We hear ringtones in the background. They're very prominently featured in the soundtrack. And these images seem to mark a very powerful contrast between the older writers who are usually portrayed in this world of traditional arts. And I'm wondering, do you worry about this younger generation's ability to enter more complex narratives like feature films, operas, novels? And do you feel in some sense we're facing a crisis in terms of the state of traditional art, culture, and literature in the face of tweets, texts, and the internet? And I'm wondering if that's part of what maybe led you to this film.
就是在这个片子里头，有好多镜头是年轻人在看手机，也经常听到那个手机响的这个声音，还是特别明显。这些镜头，我觉得跟看戏练书法那些镜头好像有一个非常强的一个对应。那我不知道您是否觉得，还是年轻一代已经失去一种能力去进入一些比较有深度、比较复杂的，比如说京剧啊、长篇小说，甚至电影，是否已经因为短信、因为网络、因为我们这种所谓的速食文化，我们很多传统的文化已经到了一种可以说是一种危机的一个边缘，你是否在拍这个片子的过程当中，在思考类似这样的一个问题，就是传统文化在速食文化的面前的一种危机？
我觉得首先，拍摄这些场面对我来说，一开始的构思是，这是一个充满语言的电影，因为作家本身他的职业特点就是语言，只不过是在电影中他们是讲出来，他们的职业是写出来，是不一样，但都是语言的东西，也就是说，通常来说也可以说是口述历史，他们用他们的讲述个人的私人的生活经验来讲述， 他们的这个故事，所以它一定是充满了语言。那么我也希望这个影片有2个部分，一部分是充满了语言的，一部分是沉默的，就是语言之外的，那一部分是历史的，因为这些语言这些讲述都是指向于历史，那么这些历史是在什么时代讲出来的？那就是当代。讲述这些历史的时代也很重要，是在一个什么样的文化环境条件、经济条件下，也是在哪一年何时何刻来讲这些历史它跟历史一样重要。所以这个影片里面也有这个有讲述大部分是历史，但是也有当代此时此刻当代现实情况的描述。就是我觉得也有私人的部分，每个人都在讲述他私人的故事，也有公共的部分。这当代的部分大部分都是在火车站、火车上、这个街头这样一些公共的空间拍摄的，它形成了这个影片的一个互补。也可以说它是一个阴阳关系的一个结构。那确实，我觉得在现实中我们去捕捉火车站、捕捉火车这些空间的时候，你会看到，年轻人他们低着头在玩手机，那么甚至也可以说不仅仅是年轻人，我觉得，因为移动互联在中国非常发达，几乎所有人的生活方法都已经是低头看手机，是我们获取信息的一个渠道。那么同时呢，也是我不知道在美国怎么样，在中国我们短视频很发达，传递信息由过去的文字变成了图像，变成了短片，那这是完全不一样的媒介，所以它也就回到一个老问题，就是我为什么这几年我一直在想，我为什么一直在拍比较漫长的时间跨度？我想就是每种新的媒介都有它的好处跟特点，就是移动互联，它的快捷普及，这是它的好处，但是它的碎片化，它的局部的就事论事的这样一个局部的限制，我觉得是没有办法取代文学一个整体的描述，一种建构，一种结构。那我觉得整体性跟结构性的思维，历史角度的思考方法是逐渐的缺失了。这也是就是我觉得，如果我们把电影称为一个传统艺术的话，我们为什么要坚持拍电影，而不是跑出去拍1分钟、2分钟的短视频的一个理由。
So indeed, when you see the film, there are a lot of these sequences filled with young people looking at their phones, checking their messages. And part of that is because this is a film about language. Writers use language as their main tool for expressing themselves. And so you can look at this almost as a kind of oral history. It's a film filled with language. It's a major part of the structure of what I'm doing here. At the same time, I wanted to juxtapose that language with silence and have a balance between these two. And so you have this really interesting relationship that comes about between the language and the silence, and what kind of cost is at play here, at risk here, as we're trying to implement this and move ahead through history. And so in Swimming Out Till the Sea Turns Blue, there's a big attention to the here and now, the contemporary, what's happening right now before our eyes. And that, again, is juxtaposed with the 70 years of history. And so, again, there's this very interesting give and take and relationship here. There's also the relationship between the private and the public. There's a lot of literature can often represent this private world, but then I have all of these sequences in public spaces and train stations, on the streets. And it, in the end, creates a kind of yin-yang relationship, right? The male and the female, the yin and the yang. And when you see those images of young people on the trains with their head down staring at their cell phones, it's not just the young people, it's almost everybody. Here in China, the internet is actually very well developed, and there's a very uh, um, powerful kind of internet culture that has been a major part of people's lives. It's how they get news, it's how they understand the world, it's their window to see how things work. And so it's not just the young people, everybody's attached to their phones and looking at these short videos and memes and little, 2-minute clips. That seems, I don't know about other countries, but in China, that's certainly what seems to dominate what so many people are watching. But most of it is for very short periods of time. They're very fractured and very limited in terms of what they can tell you. And that lies in stark difference to the kind of broad, deep, literary, descriptive narratives you can get from a novel and you can get from extended narratives. And so overall, this is part of what I'm trying to do with the structure here and what I'm trying to say about this historical perspective. And it's why I'm making a film and not a little 2-minute video. Thank you. So with that, we're going to open it up, and we have some questions here, I think. Okay, so this is a question from Lin Ying, and it's asking about Xiao. It's a great movie, but I have trouble understanding local dialects, even though I'm Chinese. Can you talk about this? So I assume the question is about why choosing to use local dialects. 好，第一个问题是我看了小五，非常喜欢这个片子，但是那个分养话我是听不懂，虽然我是中国人，我也听不懂。能不能谈谈为什么会选择要使用地方话或者方言来用，就是在您电影里面呈现？
首先抱歉，这个确实那个里面的话是山西话，就很难懂这在山西讲就十里不同音啊，就是一个县跟另一个县的语言已经不一样了。那是1997年的作品啊，当时呢这个从整体的一个美学的考虑上，我希望拍一个非常写实的作品，纪实的作品，希望在真实的县城的街道、县城的空间来拍摄，由大量的非职业演员来表演。在这个影片中，基本上都是非职业演员，所以语言就变成了一个问题。首先呢，我觉得从表演的角度来说，如果我们使用非职业演员，但是要让非职业演员用他们不熟练的普通话表演，会很不舒服，演员的发挥会有很大的限制，也就失去了我们选用非职业演员的一个理由。因为我们选中非职业演员，就是看中了非职业演员他那种自然的、即兴的、不拘束的表演。所以从这个角度，最后我们决定用山西话。就是这是使用山西话的话，这是每一个演员他们的母语，他们用母语表演，他们带着他们的这个，在他们用母语去表达的时候，他们的语言的丰富性、语言色彩的这样的一种活跃，是带给我们很多惊喜。当然，从传播上来说呢，就必须依赖于字幕了。那个时候90年代，中国观众也逐渐因为看录像、看这个那时候已经有 VCD 吧，应该就是已经基本上也习惯了看字幕、看电影所以当时就这部影片就采用了方言那更主要的，我觉得方言几乎每一种方言都是一种古老的语言那这么多年锤炼下来。方言对于情感的表达的准确度是非常的精确，它是普通话没有办法代替的所以就使用了方言。
So firstly, apologies for making you sit through the dialect in the film, but let me explain a little bit about the reason behind that. So that film, Xiao, was shot in 1997, and it's entirely in Shanxi dialect. And that has to do with the fact that when I made this film, I wanted to represent a world that really was real spaces, real places. And part of that also had to do with my reason for casting mostly, almost entirely non-professional actors in this film. Now, if you're casting unprofessional actors to go for this authenticity, dialect does pose certain problems, because if you were to require them to speak standard Mandarin in these films, that's a language that they're often not familiar with if they're all from Shanxi, and Shanxi dialect is what they're most familiar with. And so the reason that I went there and wanted non-professional actors was to get this naturalism, okay? Now, but if I made them speak Mandarin, that would be very contrived and would feel unnatural. And I would lose the very reason why I wanted to make a film like this. That is that unbridled freedom that the actors can bring and the naturalist approach. And so I had everybody speak in their mother tongue, Shanxi dialect. And part of that is to get a much richer and more natural emotional expression. And that way, what they're showing us on screen is much more lively, it's much more emotional. There's some emotions that you can get in a dialect that you simply cannot get in Mandarin. I feel in some sense these local dialects are, each one is like an ancient language that's just filled and brimming with so much personality. And that's something that you just can't get when you're speaking a standard, say, Mandarin. Of course, the result of that is that most audiences have to experience the film through the use of subtitles. But I think by this time, 1997, most people had become increasingly comfortable with watching subtitles when they see films. But that's what brought me to make that decision. Okay, and now we have a question here. What is the relationship between documentary structuring of Chinese history to films like Ash is the Purest White? 就是您在这个纪录片里面面对中国历史，跟您在江湖儿女面对历史，或者您的历史观有什么不一样吗？
实际上最主要的这两部影片它不一样的是，江湖儿女是从90年代开始的，那90年代呢，实际上是中国经济加速度发展之前，或者是准备阶段。那么随着中国经济发展的加速度，随着这种城市化，这里面的人物他们的传统的道德，他们的情感方法，他们的命运发生了很多改变，所以从历史的时间点上来说，江湖儿女基本上是中国社会经济加速度前准备阶段到经济加速度发展这个过程中人的离散，人的命运的分化，当然一直游到海水变蓝呢，它实际上是从1949年。它有更漫长的时间，这中间中国社会经历了很多社会的问题，政治经济的变化，把人放在一个更长的历史阶段里面去考察它，所以它所需要的，或者说，因为比如说90年代到当代，我个人是亲历者。我面对他的历史的态度跟从40年代讲起是不一样的，因为40年代我是70年代出生的，50年代60年代我没有经历过，那么他需要的一种历史态度就是一种聆听，我觉得对导演来说就是一种聆听，因为对电影来说我们并不做太多的判断，而是了解发生过什么，为什么会发生这样的情况，是怎么解决这些问题的？我觉得作为一种历史事实的呈现跟讲述，它跟江湖儿女不一样，就是说它需要我们有一种更加就是客观的、更加这个带有距离感的一种感受吧。
So I think one of the big differences here is that Ash is the Purest White. That's a film that, although it has a very broad historical framework, it really begins around the 90s and goes up until the present. And it's this period of rapid economic development, of urbanization, and looking at the fate of these characters and the way that they're torn apart, their lives are shattered and changed amid this backdrop during that period. Now, this is also a period that I've experienced. I have personal, I lived through the 90s. I know what this is. I experienced it. And so that's the big difference, because for a documentary like Swimming Out Till the Sea Turns Blue, the historical canvas begins much earlier in 1949. And so it's a much broader period that I'm exploring here. And it's a much more radical shift in terms of political change, economic change, all of the social change that's playing out. But most crucial for me is that I wasn't there for that. And so that makes me, it's imperative that I shift my perspective. And instead of relying on my own personal experience, I become a listener. And the most important quality for me as a director when making a film like this is sitting down and listening carefully, listening quietly, and to really tell those stories and internalize them and tell them in a way that does that history justice, and really understand what were the major questions, what were the quandaries that these people were facing, and how did they address them. And so it's really me taking a more objective approach and being a listener.
我想说的是，就是这18个篇章所涉及的问题之所以最后被提出来，我觉得它还有一个就是从一个中国的现实情况到一个全球性的情况的一个过渡。因为无论是吃饭的问题，还是恋爱自由的问题，还是生老病死的问题，还是家庭的问题，我觉得它是在一个中国的语境里面讲述的。但是当我们从这些角度去思考人的时候，我想这部影片是一个关于人的电影它不仅仅是一个关于中国人的问题，它是关于人的问题，因为它涉及的都是人要涉及到的问题，不同的政治制度，不同的经济条件下，不同的地域，发展的不同阶段的国度，个人都会面临这些问题所以你可以说它组合起来是一个国家的历史，但是对我来说，它更是一个个人的，就人的历史，就人类我们都经历了些什么那这可能是从中国乡土出发的电影不一样的是，就是带给我一个对于更广阔的普遍的人的问题的思考。
So another issue here, in terms of the 18 chapters that the film is structured in, is moving from this kind of Chinese context to a global context. And there are certain themes that appear in the film, love and illness and disease and all of these different themes that appear in these different chapters. But when it comes down to it, this is a film about human beings. It's a film about people. And it's not just about Chinese people. I think there's something much broader here that I'm exploring. All of us live under different political systems and encounter different problems. And you could look at it as a kind of Chinese national history, if you like. However, I prefer to look at it as a chapter in human history. And it's a part of that process is me coming from a very local and very native place, a very rural place, and moving from there to a much more universal place where we can explore problems and issues that affect all of humanity. And I'm wondering, Charlie, do we have time for one more, or shall I turn it back to you?
Go ahead, and I think we can do one or two more.
Okay. So 我们最后可能再提一两个问题。This one is from Lin Shiqi, and the question is, I've been inspired by genre crossing in director Jia's films, cinema in relation to literature and music, and previous use of science fiction, martial arts. Can you talk about this approach across media forms? OK, 是林世奇提的问题，是他对贾导探索的这种跨类型的探索，比如说电影跟文学之间的，或者科幻跟武侠，或者江湖电影，你经常会跨越很多不同的类型，能不能谈这种策略吧？
我觉得首先我觉得 电影作为一个已经有100多年历史的媒介，它需要它相对来说有时候它是封闭的，因为电影是一个强大的工业，但是它需要跟同时的不同的媒介产生对话关系。也就是说，我觉得电影它应该是当代文化的一部分，当代艺术的一部分，它不仅仅存在着，而且还互动着、交互着。所以跟画家交互，跟服装设计师交互，跟文学家交互，纪录片跟剧情片交互，跟突发的公共事件进行互动。那在电影早期的时候，我们会发现电影它充分的这个，它能够就我们那个，如果我们学习电影史，在20年代，可能可能第一时间这个社会这个世界发生什么，摄影机马上就会过去，它会跟公共事件产生这样一个密切的互动。我一直希望电影这个媒介能够保持这样一种活跃性，而不单单是工业规范里面的制作。这是一部分。再一部分呢，我觉得在跟不同的艺术家进行跨界的这样的一种交流，它是带给电影多重视点的一种可能性。因为实际上不同的语言，同样的人类社会，但是我们使用的是不同的语言，绘画语言或者设计的语言或者文字或者电影语言。每种语言都是一种独特的观察角度跟方法。电影它容易把不同的语言结合到一起。这是我喜欢这样一种跨界合作的一个原因。
So film as an art form has existed for more than 100 years now, but in some ways as an industry, it's a very closed art form. And one thing that I always like to do is create connections with other mediums and other medias. And so whether that be painters or clothing designers, or exploring the difference between documentary film and narrative film, this has always been something that's been quite important to me. Also, ever since the 20s, big public events have also become the subject of a lot of films and things that are happening in the world. But I feel that film needs to go past that, and it shouldn't just be limited to this kind of industrial product. And that's why I hope to have these dialogues with other creatives and different mediums, different genres that are working in other areas. And so the beauty of that is that each of these different areas represents a different language. And so designers have their own language, architects have their language, directors have their language, artists have their language. And each of these languages represent a different method for understanding the world and approaching the world. And that's something that I really thrive on and enjoy creating these dialogues. And that's why I often experiment with different mediums and genres throughout my work. And we're going to do one final question, and that is just about, well, it's a two-part question. The title of the film, and then what is your next project? 好，最后一个问题其实是两个短的问题。第一部分是能不能谈谈这部片子的标题，就是游到海里，这个为什么会选这个当主题？另外一个是您下一部片子将准备拍什么呢？
这部影片原来的标题叫做 So Close My Land， 不是这个一直游到海水变蓝。那么在拍摄到这个余华的时候，我们决定用这个新的片名，因为余华是这4组人物里面最后一个我们拍摄的人物，也就是确实是在拍摄的最后一天，我们来到他家乡的海边，他给我讲起了这个小时候游泳的故事。因为前面已经拍完了几乎所有的人物，当余华讲完这个故事的时候，我觉得就是他隐藏着内在的整个这个电影的一个内在的精神。我马上就觉得应该用一直游到海水变蓝这个名字，因为实际上我想这是一个4个人他们背后遇了那么多的问题，那么多的经历了那么多的痛苦，然后他们 一直在往前走。中国有一个很迷人的故事，叫做愚公移山。那是一个关于一对父子子子孙孙要把一座大山移走的故事。那个被认为是讲述中国人生命力、毅力的一个寓言。我觉得余华讲的这个故事，配合着几位作家的讲述，是一个海水版的愚公移山的故事。因为无论经历什么，对于中国人来说，一直走到理想的美丽的地方所谓海水变蓝的地方，就是理想的美丽的地方这是不可能中断的。所以从这个角度来说，我觉得这个片名更适合这部电影。
So, and this was not the original title of the film. Actually, it was originally titled So Close to My Land. And it was not until quite late that we changed the title. And that has to do with the segment involving the writer Yu Hua. Yu Hua was the last segment that we shot when we were making this film. And it was actually the last day of the shooting when we were working with Yu Hua that he told this story from his childhood, where he had swam out to the sea and kept wanting to, the sea was green and he had heard that it was blue and he wanted to keep swimming out until he got to that place where it turned blue. And I thought that in terms of the 4 subjects of the film, that story was so deep and told so much about what all of these writers were experiencing, this thirst and this drive to keep going and keep trying and keep doing what you need to do to achieve your dreams and achieve your goals. It also reminded me of the traditional Chinese story of the foolish old man who tried to move a mountain, where in that story of an old man everybody laughs at and says he'll never move the mountain, but he says, I'll keep going day after day, bucket after bucket of earth. And when I'm dead, my children will do it. And eventually we will move that mountain. And so this is a story that really talks about willpower and the power of perseverance and working hard to keep moving forward to finally achieving your goals. And I think that really captured so much of what all of these writers were doing, like to stay to it and to eventually, hopefully, achieve your dreams. And so that's why we eventually changed the name to Swimming Out Till the Sea Turns Blue.
我在这个去年新冠疫情之前，有2个剧本，然后在整个这个新冠疫情期间呢，又写了2个新的，所以我现在有4个计划，但是我没有确定，下来拍哪个，因为完全不同的，有历史的故事，也有当下年轻人的故事。因为确实经过新冠疫情，我觉得这个世界发生了这么大的变化，很多事情需要重新考虑。我觉得我目前处在一个思想的重新的思考阶段、组合阶段，我隐约觉得有一种崭新的东西到来了，但是我还不知道它是什么，所以我想等一等，我想用一点时间再去理解自己。
So, and as for my future plans, before COVID-19, I actually had 2 screenplays that I had completed and was ready to shoot. And then came COVID. And during that period, I wrote 2 more screenplays, which means right now I have 4 projects in hand. They range from historical films to more contemporary works about young people in China today. But COVID-19 changed so many things and really forced me to rethink so much of my life and reflect on my work. And right now, it's really a period of thinking and reflection. I sense that because of COVID-19, something brand new has emerged. And I'm not quite sure what that is, but right now I'm trying to find what it is. And that's right now I'm kind of reflecting on that and seeing where it takes me. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Charlie, and I'm going to thank Mr. Jia, so much for these wonderful answers that you provided. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, but right now I want to welcome Charlie Coker back to the Zoom stage.
Well, thanks to Director John Michael for this amazing and fascinating and insightful conversation. I can say we all very much look forward to seeing Swimming Out Till the Sea Turns Blue in the cinemas very soon. I hope that we also hope that we wanted to thank our audience for joining us tonight. And we hope that you'll also support Asia Society at the movie and programming like this by becoming a member or by making a donation. information. The slide is up on the screen. We'd also like to thank our partners and supporters for this evening's program, the Cinema Guild and the UCLA Center for Chinese Studies. In addition, we'd like to thank our promotional partners, the Asian World Film Festival, Chinese and Entertainment, Film at Lincoln Center, and New Filmmakers Los Angeles. Finally, please check out our website for upcoming screenings of outstanding Asian films and other programming. And on that, I'd like to thank you so much and have a good evening.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Michael. 谢谢大家。Thank you.
谢谢。
谢谢啊。
谢谢。